One, I want to give all praises and honor and glory to the only true God of heaven and earth, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Israel, whose true name is Yahweh, and to his only begotten Son, the Messiah, the Lamb of God, that taketh away the sins of Israel by the shedding of his own blood, whose true name is Yahweh Shai, whom the world ignorantly calls Jesus. And double honors to my elders and teachers, and great most of them, and honors to all the prophets and teachers that carry the spirit of faith and the spirit of truth within them. My name is Zachariah. Hear my speech concerning the truth, that is the word of the living God, which word pertains to you Israelites, which are you so-called Negroes, Hispanics, Latinos, and Native Indians, even you Israelites, who may have the appearance of the heathen, who may have the identity of the heathen, are really descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, if you have the gift of faith, if you believe in Yahweh and Yahweh Shai, in the word, in salvation, in life everlasting through Yahweh Shai, through the gospel, then that is an evidence that you are an Israelite and that you may be an elect of Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shai, an elect of Israel. For the Spirit of the Most High have testified through prophets, through apostles, through holy men concerning the faith of the election, on how the just shall live by faith, on how faith is as a treasure being gathered. So if you believe, then again, you are an Israelite and you may be an elect of Israel. The focus of this lesson is concerning the evil times that draw near and the salvation in the midst, which we have through Yahweh Shai, according to the goodness of Yahweh. See, Yahweh have made Yahweh Shai unto us the way unto salvation. He have made Yahweh Shai our sufficiency, right? He is sufficient for the things pertaining to righteousness, to the things pertaining to life, to salvation, to protection, to peace. Now, in this lesson, I'm going to be going into, symbolic language, metaphors, and ultimately the nature of Yahweh Shai. Now, it is being reported in Gary, Indiana, that there is, in Northwest Indiana, tens of thousands of people have gone more than 9 days without power. Schools are closed. Families are lining up for food and living in survival mode. Now, this is not front page news. It is being reported that it's not being reported. It's being said that this is not being, mainstreamed. And there's so many people in the area speaking on how there are, chaos to a degree. There is disorder in the streets. It's being reported that people who could fix, you know, the power are being shot at. Now, I wanted to touch on this real quick. Let's see where it is. It's being reported by Daily Express US. US at risk of 18-month long blackouts that could extend across the country, experts claim. New York Post, shockingly, vulnerable US power grid could result in 18-month nationwide blackout, expert warns. So it's being signaled by the elites that there will be a potential blackout in the country, in the United States of America. And the prophets, the apostles, the teachers whom the Lord have set up, have warned of this, have prophesied of these, of such failure, of the infrastructure of this kingdom, cyber infrastructure disruption or failure, economic failure, uh, financial failure, just chaos, and that's one aspect, they have, warned of and, prophesied of. Now it is written in the book of 2nd Ezra chapter 15, you can read it yourself. The Lord have said that he will plague Egypt as he did before. Now this Egypt is regarding, speaking about, America, which is spiritual Egypt. America has the epithet of Egypt, of Babylon, of different epithets in the Bible. And through the spirit and power of Yahweh Bashim Yahweh Shah, we have the interpretation, the understanding of these mysteries. That is, these scriptures, which are mysterious in nature. So the Lord have given us the understanding, so we know that America is spiritual Egypt. The Egypt, spoken about in different passages of the Bible. So the Lord is going to plague America as he did ancient Egypt. And one of the things the Lord have did was brought a darkness upon ancient Egypt. The Lord did many things against Egypt, that hurt it, economically, socially, psychologically, you know, you know, agriculturally, the Lord hurt it, ancient Egypt. And so will the Lord do in these last days, and it's been signaled by high elites, people in high places among the families of Edom, of a cyber attack, a cyber epidemic, you know, uh, of a blackout, just a failure of a cyber infrastructure. So this is for sure coming. We're gonna have to see how it turns out, but I want to go into the book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 17, and read a couple of scriptures real quick. And this is the GNT translation. Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 17, verse 1. And this is speaking about the account of the Lord's plague upon Egypt that, led to darkness. It says, O Lord, your acts of judgment are marvelous and hard to explain. That is why people who had not been taught about them went astray. When lawless people imagined that they had your holy nation in their power, they were themselves imprisoned in a long night of darkness. They lay in their houses, shut off from your eternal care, which is the sun. So the Lord uh, separated those Egyptians from the sun, which is provision. You know, well, as it says here, an eternal care. And you think about metaphor, biblical language. The sun is figurative for prosperity and power. It's figurative for authority, for prosperity, for protection and security as well. You know, from darkness, from shadow, which is metaphorically associated to something negative. So when it comes to this society, to this kingdom, and the people within it, the security, and the provision, the power that this place have to offer will eventually fail. You know, it will eventually fail. And there's many scriptures in the Bible that signify that an economic collapse, again, cyber infrastructure failure or disruption, societal collapse, in many of its, aspects, scriptures signify a time of trouble, a time of sorrow, and a time of torment, you know. So the sun, which is, the source of security, the source of provision, is a symbol of, of prosperity, of security, of provision, of power, of prosperity, and it's a symbol of something um reliable because what is the nature, the quality of the sun? It's sure, it's absolute, and it's in its course. It's an inevitable force, shall I say? Now, Yahweh Shai, he is uh, described as the light. He is described as the sun, the morning star, the day spring, the brightness. And the reason why is because Yahweh Shai, he himself, you know, uh, have, you know, uh, a similar nature or a similar quality of what being sure, being steadfast, faithful. Every night you can always trust, you can always, rely upon the sun coming up, you know? So it is with Yahweh Shai. He is having qualities, comparable to the sun, of being sure, of being strong, of being steadfast. He is the truth, the way, the life, and the truth, and the counsel that cometh by him. The scriptures tell you, or in the book of Isaiah, he has the epithet of being a counselor. So through his counsel, through the testimony of Yahweh Shai, there is a sure foundation, wherein we may profit, and obtain life, You know, you know, you know, we may have that which is sufficient. You know, Yahweh Shai, He is our sufficiency. See, you think about this modern society, this modern time. We are in the age of technology. You know, of of all these different things. You know, this modernity where we, well, not us, and it's truth because we're laying hold upon, and taking refuge upon something outside of this world, right? But those of this world, they lean upon this modern, system that is very feeble, you know, that can be hindered. For example, cyber attacks, certain, hits, sophisticated hits by the elites to bring about an economic collapse. It's prone to hurt. It's prone to failure. It's prone to uh, um, to change. But Yahweh Shai, just as the sun, is, it's sure, it's faithful. So Yahweh Shai, He is, our sufficient, our competent, our sure source of, of salvation, our sure source of life, of provision, of protection from darkness, from shadow. you know. So from there, I'm gonna go to the book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 18, real quick. It says verse 1, yet all the while a brilliant light was shining for your people. Their enemies heard their voices, but couldn't see them. They envied the good fortune of people who were not suffering. Yeah, while the Egyptians were in a supernatural darkness, our forefathers Israel had light among us. You know, now, making a spiritual parallel, you know, comparison, a Yahweh Shai, He is our light from God, you know, among a land of the shadow of death. And that's what America is. It's a land of shadows, of death, of darkness. The scripture says gross darkness covers the earth. And then ultimately, it tells you in the book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 5. Chapter 5, Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 5. Um, Verse 23, it says, great windstorms will blow them away like straw. Lawlessness will be the ruin of the whole. So darkness, gross darkness covers the earth. So wickedness, lawlessness, iniquity, idolatry, adultery, deceit, falsehood, damnable and condemnable, heresies and doctrines, cover the earth, which is associated or resulted in what? Destruction, of death. So lawlessness will be the ruin of the whole earth, of the whole world. Evil actions will cause governments to fall. And this is, we are in a time such as that, a time of ruin and a time of government and systems collapsing, institutions, you know, um, things that people put their confidence in, you know. Um, but Yahweh Shai in a land in a world of darkness and in a land of darkness, of death, Yahweh Shai, he is the light, So I want to go here, you know, add more onto, the nature of Yahweh Shai, and this is the divine nature given to Yahweh Shai, from God, you know. This is Luke chapter 1, verse 78. Because of God's tender mercy, the morning light from heaven is about to break upon us. And that was Yahweh Shai. From God, he came to do God's will. He came to testify the things of God. He came to preach the doctrine of God. In his very life, in his very ministry, in his very death and resurrection, Yahweh Shai uh, was and is the working, the manifestation, an expression of God's mercy, through his blood, the shedding of his blood, we have the remission of sins, forgiveness of sins, through his wounds are we healed. Yahweh Shai, he is, the very believing, the very faith in Yahweh Shai and believing in Yahweh Shai. That is of itself, an aspect of righteousness before Yahweh. Because as it is written in the book of Romans, Yahweh Shai, it speaks about how righteousness, is revealed, which is associated with faith, you know. So this is the righteousness that Yahweh had revealed from heaven, Yahweh Shai. He is our righteousness. He is our sanctification. He is our redemption. He is our wisdom. He is our strength. He is the power of God unto salvation, as Paul put it in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 1. The very preaching of the cross, the very preaching of the testimony of Yahweh Shai is the power of God unto salvation, as Paul put it, So Yahweh Shai, he is, you know, you know, compared to the sun. It says to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide us to the path of peace. And that's exactly what Yahweh Shai did. That's exactly what Yahweh Shai is doing. And as long as we continue in the faith and continue in the doctrine, in the truth of these scriptures, we would have that which is sufficient for salvation and life. This is our power source. Um, Psalm chapter 19, verse 5. It says, which is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, and rejoiceth as a strong man to run a race. And this is speaking about the sun. His going forth is from the end of the heaven, and his circuit unto the ends of it. And there is nothing hid from the heat thereof. And the point is that it's a sure, um, um, you know, it's a sure creature. It's a sure force. And the sun, it's a creature. It's a creation of Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. Right, but the point is that it's it's sure. It's absolute, it's steadfast. You know why? Because it's associated with God's power. You know, this very system of the heavens and the earth. Is associated or is upheld by God's power, by God's word. You know, so heaven and earth, the sun, the moon, these things are not going to pass away because ultimately, that's how the Lord have established it. But speaking about Yahweh Shai, he has, a quality comparable of what being steadfast, of being sure. So this system, this kingdom, you know, this infrastructure is going to collapse. It's prone to failure. It can be hurt. It can be frustrated. It can be disappointed. Right? But when it comes to Yahweh Shai, the counsel of Yahweh Shai, and the insight we have through the scriptures, it cannot be letted. It cannot be hindered. It cannot be frustrated. It cannot be hurt. It cannot fail. In fact, in the book of First Corinthians, chapter, this is one of my favorite scriptures. I've been, bringing out lately. First Corinthians chapter 1, verse 24. It says, "But unto them which are called, both Jews and Greeks, Israelites, born under circumcision and Israelite Gentiles, who live at this as the heathen with a heathen state of mind." It says, Mashiach, the power of God and the wisdom of God. So Yahweh Shai, he is the power of God and the wisdom of God. Now, in the book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, there's a description of the nature, of the quality of wisdom, which Yahweh Shai, is a standard of, you know, he is the power of God and the wisdom of God, as I just read, so he's the standard, the face, an aspect, a focus of God's wisdom, the center of God's power. He's the standard of it. And through him, and through the preaching of him, through faith in him, and through his working, through his life and his death and resurrection, through his grace, we have an opening a door onto salvation. This is Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7. And and when you read about wisdom, it's important to know that, intellectual, it's not always an intellectual, it's not always regarding, an intellectual dimension, shall I say. There's many aspects of wisdom. In this chapter, wisdom represents, God's power. It represents God's wisdom, God's goodness. It's described as a pure living force, as a pure influence. So there's many aspects of wisdom. You could say that the holy angels, when we read this chapter, the holy angels are an aspect of the wisdom that is being spoken of in this chapter. Even the Holy Spirit, is an aspect of that pure influence that floweth from Yahweh, you know, Yahweh Shai, is, an ultimate perspective, standard wisdom. He's the face, so it's always, describing an intellectual, you know, you know, it's not always centered around an intellectual, the intellectual mind or dimension or understanding. When you go into these particular chapters, just as it, in Book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, it tells you that wisdom is manifold, the law, statutes, commandments, which is by the inspiration of the spirit and power of Yahweh Bashem Yahushua. That's an aspect of wisdom. These very words, words of wisdom, just showing you is associated with his power and his goodness. Forgive me, it's slow. This is Book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verse Salaki. Verse 22. It says, the spirit of wisdom is intelligence, or intelligent and holy. So it's an actual force, it's a spirit. There's many aspects to it says it is of one nature or reveals itself in many ways. It is not made of any material substance, and it moves about freely. It is clear, clean, and confident. It cannot be harmed. It loves what is good. It is sharp and unconquerable. And yeah, you think about, Yahweh Shai and what Yahweh Shai is associated with, omnipotence, all power and authority in heaven and in earth. The whole system, and dominion of the heavens, of the angels. What can conquer that? What can hinder that? What can go against that? What can go against that? So you can't really conquer that. In Isaiah chapter 59, when the enemy shall come in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord shall lift up a standard against them. So the Lord is going to intervene in a miraculous, divine way in a time of adversity when those military troops, soldiers, armed forces may, surround or come against believers. The Spirit of the Lord shall lift up a standard against that, against him. And ultimately, we have access to that. We have association to that power. Via Yahweh Shai. according to the goodness of God, according to the will of God, you know? Because Yahweh Shai, he is the very access and point of God's power and his wisdom and his presence. You know, the scriptures tell you in the book of Colossians, chapter 2, that Yahweh Shai in him bodily dwelleth the fullness of Godhead, right? The divine essence and qualities Yahweh Shai have. So omnipotence, omniscience, you know, rule and control over the heavens and operation of the heavens. You know, those angels going to protect you, brothers, you know, because you are connected, you are associated with Yahweh Shai. You know, he's the door whereby you have, you know, some standing, you know, in the presence and in the company of God and in the company of holy angels. You know, he's the friend in high places. You know, because if it wasn't for Yahweh Shai, we would have been separate from God. You know, we will have no mediator with God. You know, we would have been enemies. You know, if it wasn't for Yahweh Shai, if it wasn't for faith in Him, which of itself is a gift. You know, it says kind and a friend of humanity. You know, in this case, the Israelites. You know, the Lord is not a friend to the world, the nations, and stuff like that. You know, it's a friend to the world of Israel. You know, it says it is dependable and sure. And is this not uh, 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 the nature of Yahweh Shai and his testimony? You know, his counsel, his knowledge, his insight, you know, his instructions. It says, and it has no worries. Yeah, there's no fear. You know, there's no there's no doubt. You know, and this is why ultimately one of the things that Yahweh Shai, you know, will cultivate among the temple of God. You know, starting with the apostles, the disciples, you would cultivate a spirit of faith. You know, you would cultivate faith, which is the opposite or different to doubt, to fear, because as long as you're connected, you know, to the vine, and we as the branches, you know, as long as you're connected to the vine, which is Yahweh Shai, and the husbandman is Yahweh, as Yahweh Shai put it in the book of John. You know, you you know you will bring forth fruit. You know, Yahweh Shai, but generally, you know, as long as you're connected to the vine, hey, you're good. You know, everything is sure. Everything is of profit. Everything is of an advantage unto you. You know, and when a man has an advantage, there should be no fear. You know, you know that's what they say, the law of the jungle. You know, someone have to have the advantage over the other. You know, so there's no fear, there's no worry. You know, in this wisdom, which centers around Yahweh Shai. You know, which Yahweh Shai in the testimony, Yahweh Shai is the center of it. So there's no fear, there's no worry, there's no doubt. You know, there's no lapse, there's no there's none of that. You know, and again, Yahweh Shah will cultivate that among the temple. Starting with the disciples. Think about Peter. You know, during that account when Yahweh Shah was walking in the time of a storm upon the water, Yahweh Shah was walking upon the water, and the disciples in the ship, they thought it was a ghost. They thought it was a spirit. And Yahweh Shah calmed them, said it was him, you know. And Peter, through, a measure of faith, asked to come upon the water and to walk over to him. And Yahweh Shai allowed it. And Peter, he was walking upon the water for a moment. And when the storm was raging, Peter let doubt seep into his mind. Yahweh Shai, he basically said, wherefore didst thou doubt? So Yahweh Shai would, from time to time, you know, uh, uh, will take a stand against doubt. Because when it comes to him, when it comes to his testimony, when it comes to the whole working and the power of God, which Yahweh Shai is the center of it, there's no doubt in that. There's no failure in that. It's dependable, it's sure, it's steadfast. And I may be saying certain things over and over again, forgive me. It says it has power over everything. And omnipotence. Now, did not Yahweh Shai, all power was given to him in heaven and in earth? Is it not written in the book of Colossians chapter 2 that he is the head of all principality and power? You know, it is written in the book of Colossians that in Yahweh Shai bodily dwelleth the fullness of Godhead, which translates to what? Divinity or deity. So Yahweh Shai, he holds omnipotence, and being associated with Yahweh Shai via faith, and being a servant and a disciple, and a follower, being associated with him, being united with him, you're also united with that which he himself is associated with, is the head of, you know. It says it has power over everything and sees everything. Omniscience, yeah, it oversees all things. Yeah, you think about um the nature of God, which Yahweh Shai shares, which is what? An eternal perspective. Everything pertaining to the future, universally, everywhere in every place, is already perceived and overseen, So nothing will happen without the permission. And Yahweh Shai, he said that concerning God. He spoke about in one of his teachings that he spoke about the birds and how we're of more value than birds. And there is not among all the birds in existence, there is not one bird that dies without the Father's permission, outside of the Father's will. And Yahweh Shai, he said, he taught that, you know. And what does this imply? What does this signify? That everything is in hand, everything's in control, you know. And now Yahweh Shai, he's given that nature. He has that nature of being omnipotent, omniscient, you know, you know. So this is not to exclude the Father in any way, shape, or form, but rather including Yahweh Shai. And this is the glory that the Father have given to Yahweh Shai, because Yahweh have included Yahweh Shai in the honor and the glory, because Yahweh Shai, you know, he becomes a display, a mirror of God's glory himself, you know, in his life, in his ministry, in his death and resurrection. We come to understand God's glory, the greatness of his power, you know, the depth of his love, sending his son, his only begotten son, his first creation, and he loved very much for ungodly people. So we understand to a degree, Yahushua becomes a figure of expression of God's, glory, of God's love, of God's power, you know. So we did in no way, shape, or form is Yahweh excluded, you know. They may do that in Christianity and the Catholic Church, you know. But according to the goodness and the love and the honor which he have towards the Son, he have included the Son, which they are two. They are one, but yet they are two. Because Yahweh is a creation of the God of Yahweh. You know, the Trinity doctrine, that's confusion. You know, Yahweh is of Yahweh. You know, and he's united with Yahweh. He's the first creation of Yahweh. You know, he is subject to Yahweh. You know, he calls Yahweh the Father and God. You know. But anyways, let's continue reading. It says it penetrates every spirit, intelligence, no matter how delicate its substance may be. Verse 24, it says wisdom moves more easily than motion itself. Yeah, it is mobile. It's active. In other words, yeah, you think about the realm of heaven, the angels, the holy angels, the Holy Spirit. They are active forces. You know, it's a real active force that is working, that is active within the moral and intellectual dimension of you believers. That's why you believe, understand, and that's why you have the ability to teach, to edify, you know, to remember, you know, to rationalize things the right way according to God's will. You know, you think about the angels that protect and guard you elect, just like in the book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 10. That chapter goes into wisdom as well, and it describes wisdom. Now, it describes, the account of Lot being saved from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, it describes the angels as being an aspect of that pure influence, that divine force of God that delivered Lot and those with him from that destruction. So now we know that when it comes to this wisdom, an aspect of wisdom, is associated with the angels, the holy angels. And the angels, they're active. The heavens is active, you know. This word is active. You know, the word. You think about these scriptures, which is an aspect of wisdom as well. It's interconnected with divine power, with God's power. You think about these prophecies. It's interconnected with His sovereignty. Everything and every creation is subject to it. You think about the earthquakes, and the earth, the natural world, nature itself. It's moving according to the rhythm of the scriptures. Earthquakes in diverse places, as Yahushua prophesied, is because these very scriptures, these very words, these very prophecies, it is interconnected with divine power. So, the world probably sent for, different angels from time to time to, pour out force upon the earth to shake, earthquakes, it's interconnected with His power. You came to, let's say this, give you understanding. You can't really, it's best not to separate the angels from God's power. They are the many aspects and manifestations or agents, shall I say, of God's power, you know? And Yahweh Shai, He is the head under God of that power, of that system, you know? And you think that, rejecting Yahweh Shai, rejecting His word, disobeying Him, you still gonna have that help from heaven? You're gonna have that heavenly protection? No, you know. It says she is so pure that she penetrates everything. Yeah, you think about, again, as I said, all nations, all created to the word, because all nations are subject to God's power, to His influence. They're subject to it, and they are ruled by it. You know, you know, it's For example, you think about Proverbs chapter 21. It says that the hearts of kings is in the hand of the Lord. So God's power even penetrates the soul and the mind of men. You think Esau had mind control? How much more God Himself? You know, even now these kings, they're moving according to the permission of God. That's ultimately going to eventually lead to World War III, to economy and infrastructure failure. Different decisions and moves that Washington is making, that Israel's making, that Turkey is making, that Iran is making, the spirit that's upon Iran, the disposition, the attitude that they have, that rulership have. They don't have it of themselves. It was given to them by God. It was inspired. It was implanted. You know, it says she is the breath of God's power. So it's an expressive force. It says a pure and radiant stream of glory from the Almighty. Nothing that is defiled can ever still its way into wisdom. Yeah, you think about that magician in the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, he thought to buy his way into God's power. Right? Those of you who know that account in the book of Acts, there was a magician who saw, God's power by the hands of the apostle. And he thought to buy his way into that power, to get access into that power in a wicked way. But really, faith becomes that access through faith in Yahweh while Yahweh Shai. Faith, it is a means of access in a way. And there's scriptures that implies that. You think about in the book of in the Gospels, you know, Yahweh Shai will always state on how right after he would do his miracles, or when he's doing the miracles, when he's performing or executing God's power, displaying God's power, he will sometimes say, according to your faith, it is done. And he will do the healings, you know, the miraculous healings, of those who may have some ailments, some disorder, some sickness. He will say, according to your faith, is it done? So faith is heavily signified or implied in scripture as being an access. It's like, all rivers is connected to the sea. You can say faith is a river that is connected, that draws from, and that accesses, you know, the broad rivers, the broad sea. So, and it tells you in the book of First Corinthians that faith, it is a gift. It is a gift from God, from God's Spirit. So in a way, that's a divine enablement, an enablement. It's a divine ability to believe, to have evidence and witness within of the things that are invisible. You know, that's why Yahweh Shai had made statements concerning faith on how having faith as a seed, or as a mustard seed, you shall be able to say unto the mountain, from your place and be uh, established in the sea. You know, you'll be able to do impossible things through faith. So faith becomes, an access to this power, which shows even more, you know, you know, highlights even more a principle of these teachings, of these doctrines. One of the main principles is faith. You know, without faith, you can do nothing. You cannot please God. You know, without faith, you can do nothing, man. So no one can access no undefiled thing, or no defiled thing can access wisdom. So going back to that musician, he thought to buy, use physical material gain value, to gain his way into the divine source, the divine power, the power of God. But the apostle rebuked him. The apostle rebuked him. So this shows you that moving in these last days, faith is a must. If you want protection, if you want salvation, if you want God's power on your side. It says she is a reflection of eternal light and a perfect mirror of God's activity and goodness. So the point is that, these are all different natures and qualities that Yahweh Shai share, So going back to Lord, and I'm not too loud, Lord, this thing is kind of slow. Bear with me. Got that one. Bear with me. This is Psalm chapter 84, verse 11. Let's see if I want to read up real quick. Okay, Psalm chapter 84, verse 11 says, "For Yahweh God is a sun and shield. Yahweh will give grace and glory. No good thing will he withhold from them that walk uprightly. O Yahweh of hosts, blessed is the man trusted in thee." You know, so and Yahweh Shai, he shares in that nature. He reflects that nature. The nature of God of being protection, being the source of life and security and care. Yahweh Shai, he shares in, he reflects that nature. Because Yahweh Shai, he is the express image of God's person. He is the brightness of his majesty. Right? He is the utmost representation of God. He is the access to God's presence, in the very point of God's presence. So without Yahweh Shai, you're without God. As Yahweh Shai put it, he that seeth him, seeth the Father. No man have seen the Father but the Son, but he himself. So Yahweh Shai, he is the faithful and true witness of God. You know. Let's read this. I'm gonna just close off in that bowl and this lesson at 5. So the evil days draw near. There's a hope. And this is on First Esdras chapter 4, verse 38. As for truth, it endureth, it is always strong, it liveth, it conquereth forevermore. I'm going to close off and now I'm going to give all praises and honor and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Ruchach, Wadash. Shalom.